Well, welcome to this, the latest reaction event for our subscribers. I'm joined this evening by Quentin Letts, sketchwriter for The Times and theatre critic, and author of this extraordinary new book, Stop Bloody Bossing Me, about how we need to stop being told what to do. Now, you can order a copy of this book. If you'd like it signed, we can arrange all of that. So we'll send an email later to subscribers, and we can make all that happen. If you'd rather not have a signed copy, just go and buy it anyway, because it's terrific. I would describe it as a blast of fresh air to blow away the lockdown blues. Now, in essence, Quentin, you've had enough.
There's an Adrian Henry poem, I think, and it's 2 lines, and it said, "I'm just about at breaking point, she snapped." And that's how I felt at times during lockdown. And yes, I've come over all unnecessary, Ian. I've exploded like Mr. Creosote. And this is a book of an irascible little book. You called it extraordinary, which of course can mean anything. It can mean it's extraordinarily bad. But it's a book of intemperate explosion against rules and all the bloody people, can I say bloody people who are telling us what to do the whole time. And it struck me that there is this new class of people who I call the bossocracy, who are people who wag their digits at us and tell us what to do, largely or quite often because they themselves are making money out of it.
Now, were you surprised in lockdown that the British succumbed to this quite so easily? Because I think quite a lot of people had this myth in their head, this idea of, particularly relating to English society, this idea that merry England, land of the free, interest in liberty, and that turns out to be about 20% of the population, doesn't it? Or am I being unfair? Large numbers of people really like being bossed about.
Well, so it seems. And the focus groups, Downing Street's doing all these focus groups, and the focus groups keep telling them, oh yeah, we're really enjoying lockdown. But it turns out that a lot of the focus groups are composed of middle-class people with big gardens who live in Surrey. And of course, they've had a wonderful lockdown. I don't know how balanced these focus groups are. I'm a little bit skeptical about the numbers, but you're right, I think, that a surprising number of people, surprising to me, have been very meek about it. And it's been like watching one man and his dog, isn't it? I mean, we've all been sheep into the pen. And what happened to the old buddy-mindedness of the Brits? Well, it doesn't seem to be there. I used to live in Ireland. I spent 4 very happy, drunken years of my life in Dublin. And I was expecting the Irish, at least, to be a bit more disobedient. I love the Irish and the way that they are very sceptical about rules. But even they have done what they've been told to, it seems. So I don't know. Perhaps it's because the government has been extraordinarily assiduous in terrifying people. And you can look at the notes from one of those SAGE committees where they talk about the desire to frighten the pants off people in order to make them do what the government wanted them to do. And so that's a bit creepy to me. But yes, I was dismayed, really, by the way that people have obeyed. But actually, you know, here in Herefordshire, people have been a bit less law-abiding, I think. And maybe the further you go out of the cities, the naughtier people are. And also, I've got a suspicion that the youngsters are being a bit more disobedient. And that gives me great hope for the future.
And possibly lying to pollsters. But you have this weird feedback loop, don't you, where the government is polling people to try and find out what they're scared of, and then using those phrases, and this was one of the main features of last spring, to then broadcast them back. And of course, they had control of the airwaves through the briefings and enormous amounts of advertising they could buy very cheaply because commercial advertising had sort of disappeared. Yeah. So they were transmitting those messages back and then focus grouping people again to discover that they were of course completely terrified.
I know. And if you, I mean, the advertisements themselves were not in the form of 1940s, 1950s public information films, where you get some chap with a posh voice giving recommendations. These were really emotive adverts. I used to listen to them on Classic FM. I'd pick them up on there, and they were really creepy, actually. Sort of saying, here's somebody who's dying, and it's basically all your fault if you break the law, so break the rules. And so I've been pretty horrified, actually, by the way the government's behaved. I've gone right off. I was never a big fan of big government, but I'm even more boilingly suspicious of them.
And do you think is it a function of technology as well, and big tech making this feasible? Because the way in which we've lived in the last year wouldn't have been possible, say, 20 or 30 years ago. Or is it that it's always been there? It's certainly been there as a Scot. It's there in Calvinism. It's there in the Scottish religious tradition, but it's also there, I suppose, with Cromwell, isn't it? It's there in the 17th century. Puritanism.
Well, if you're going to talk about Calvinism, surely you're talking about nonconformism, and the old nonconformist spirit seems to have disappeared. What's happened to people telling authority to get lost? But I mean, there have been a few of us, the resistance. There we are, like the French Marquis in Herefordshire. I think a lot of the people who have been obeying the rules very decently, they've been doing it very decently. I'm not calling them sheep, really. I'm calling them very decent law-abiding citizens. I think that actually, possibly in their hearts, they themselves feel a bit dirty for having been so obedient, and also, like the rest, like me, certainly, they are bubbling with indignation about some of the extremes. For instance, there was that horrific case of the crematorium in Milton Keynes, where a woman had lost her husband there. She was sitting on her own because she had to sit so far apart from the other mourners. She started crying, and her two sons moved their chairs a little bit to be closer to her and give her a hug at the funeral. And some jobsworth comes bursting in from the back of the crem and says, "No, sorry, you can't do that," in a sort of E.L. Wisty voice, and broke up the funeral, interrupted it, and they then had to separate again. Horrendous. I mean, that is beyond justification, I think.
Yeah. Now, I should point out we're going to have some time for questions about halfway through, so you can go to the Q&A function and ask, whether it's about this book or sketch writing or theatre or anything you'd like to ask Quentin. Go to the Q&A thing, and I'll do my best. We already have a pile of questions which people have emailed in earlier. Now, you haven't spared anyone; they all get it in the neck. The high priests of the pandemic. And now, let me read this on the side.
About the pandemic, of course. It's not just about the pandemic. I mean, it is about other things.
Yes,
as well.
Yes.
The pandemic has been a high watermark.
We'll get onto that. But just on the scientists, you describe Whitty as lean, pale, witty, with a drain pipe neck and gulpy eyes. He only needed a white coat to complete the stereotype of an overworked clap doctor. Vallon's chief scientific advisor was better tailored, with you somehow felt less of a smell of hospital pee about him. Things began to go wrong when another of Sage, our friend Neil Ferguson, started to push his chops around the media. It's fascinating the way you do. I love the chapter on expertise and the way you think they've sort of devalued themselves by making themselves media talking heads, or you said parading themselves as media pundits, which of course is our job, isn't it, really? Parading ourselves as media pundits. But weren't they just trying to communicate weighty matters in an accessible way?
Well, that's very charitable of you. I must say, Ian. I don't know. Will I write about the clap doctor? I'd have to bow to your superiority on that. Yeah, of course, it's important for people at the top of government to talk to the public and tell them what's going on. But what you were getting with the Sage lot, and there's a cast of thousands, like a Cecil B. DeMille film, the number of people on Sage, they're popping up and talking about their own theories rather than what the decisions that the committee had reached. And it became a case of let me use my position on Sage in order to promote myself as a scientist, and maybe get an op-ed in The Guardian, and maybe get on Channel 4 News, and maybe that way I can do my college some good, because if you're a don, You get on the air, then you win extra brownie points, and that gains extra funding for your college. And I don't know, I just thought it was a bit smelly. And anyone who came up from Sage and said something that was pro-lockdown was suddenly called distinguished or eminent or leading. Whereas those who said otherwise and said that they thought lockdown was doing some damage in other respects were called maverick. That's the way that the BBC operates, very crafty. And I just thought it was becoming the Sage people were really they ran amok. They were running amok, and were treating it as a self-promotional exercise.
There's a very good chapter on the culture of offence, which you're very annoyed that everyone seems to be offended. As you said, the book is about a lot more than just the pandemic, though it's written against the backdrop,
including me.
But you describe it as a third-party grievance, almost as a way of bullying us, and that everyone now has the right to be permanently offended about something.
Well, I think that this is not entirely controversial to say that a lot of the greatest proponents of grievance are people who work in the third sector, the charity sector as it used to be called, or people who are professional activists who whip up indignation, and quite often the public might not be feeling that particularly cross about something. And if you say something mildly disobliging about vegans, your average vegan will laugh at it, tell you not to be such an arse, and will get on with his or her life. But the Vegan Liberation Front will come down on you and will take to Twitter. And suddenly you have a great big hoo-ha, and your employer might be told that they have to sack you, otherwise all the advertising will dry up. So there's quite a lot of that going on. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that. And I almost got into trouble the other day on GMTV, or whatever it's called these days, when I suggested that some of the people who were getting worked up about that race report the other day were people who earn their living out of working in race relations, who were feeling that they were horrified, thought that race relations might in the country be a little bit better than they had depicted. So, I mean, I said that, and I could sense that the ITV people were trying to get me, but happily it was early in the morning on a bank holiday, so nobody was watching.
But it is having a chilling effect, isn't it? In that it's creating an atmosphere in which large numbers of people feel that they have to have these conversations and make these sort of remarks that you're prepared to make in public, that they're doing something almost illicit, or talking to each other in the pub about it. Well, not in the pub at the moment, but hopefully we'll do soon. And that they're somehow being naughty. Yes,
and somehow being wicked, having an opinion. And I'm not sure chilling is the word. Actually, I think it's the other end of the thermometer. I think these people are trying to create heat, and they're trying to make life much more unpleasant, sort of like the fires of hell underneath us. And I think it's a great pity, and I'm brassed off about it. I think a lot of people are, but a lot of people feel, oh, not say that in case I get into trouble at work about that.
Mm. And you talk about care for clappers, which is particularly wound you up, which is the phenomenon during the crisis. But that's an example, isn't it, of modern buzzword virtue signaling, but again bullying people to express one view, to hold a consensus view and to express it.
Yeah, it was a lovely idea at first, wasn't it? And people readily joined in. They thought, this is a sweet idea, let's do that, the good old NHS, and show the nurses we love them. And they did it for the second week, because let's do that again, but nothing else to do. And the third week, they thought, well, shall we do it again? Oh, we're not sure about that. But then there was this pressure started to build, maybe from neighbours, but more, I think, from there were certain people at the NHS who would try to promote this very much. As you really must do this. It was a campaign. It became a political campaign, and it ended up in quite nasty circumstances, with people being sneaked on by their neighbours. Some people for not taking part in it. And now the care for clappers thing has become a company. So I think it's an illustration of how a sweet, voluntary idea becomes something where there is pressure on you to jolly well take part and do what we say. And it became much less attractive after that.
And of course, that was in support of the NHS. And you sort of question the holy grail of the crisis is the great shining thing of the crisis is the performance of the NHS. And without diminishing the work of individual people working in the NHS, you pose the question: has it really proved its worth, or does it really deserve as much praise?
Oh God! I mean, I'm not nearly qualified. I don't have an orthodox or an unorthodox view about this. I'm not dogmatic about it, but undoubtedly the NHS is brilliant in some respects, brilliant, but also awful in other respects. And the GPs did not, I think, distinguish themselves. A lot of them operated at low energy in this. And I've got a brother I've got a sibling who's got cancer, and his experience of the NHS during this was pretty hairy. So I don't want to get into NHS bashing because it's not justified, but you must be allowed in this political world to question the structures of the NHS, because otherwise the thing's never going to get better.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about politics more broadly. I mean, it touches on the crisis a bit, but Sturgeon and Drakeford. The Sturgeon comparison with Fulton Mackay in Porridge is quite something. But I was going to ask you what you think that's about. You're a great observer of politics. It seems to be that another thing which has been accelerated in the crisis is a diverging in politics. In that politics in England has become much more English. The Tories are riding high, almost 50% in the polls in England. And in Scotland, the Nationalists are almost 50%. And then something curious is happening in Wales. Do you feel there's...
I don't know what's happening in Wales. It's hard to say what's happening in Wales, but in Scotland, certainly. Nicola Sturgeon has really run this crisis brilliantly in that she's been so cruel and so bossy. And Scots seem to have lapped this up. Beat me more, missus, beat me more. And she has, they've had her every day at them. She's done the press conference every day with a in a dominatrix outfit, pretty much. And they've been loving it, apparently. I suppose it's because she's been able to present the idea of the lockdown as that of a firm politician. If you are firm in politics, if you are certain about your views, if you don't bother with our old friend Mr. Nuance, then a lot of people think, well, we certainly know where she's coming from, and it's quite good for your brand. Whether or not it makes for good public administration, whether or not it brings down the death rate, I don't know. I suspect not. But the Scots have been they've been going for it in a big way, and so poll ratings have been going up. And old Drippy Drakeford, my goodness, he's a wet old bit of turbot. But he saw what was happening in Scotland, and he at the start of the crisis, he was a complete non-event. I mean, he could walk into a room with the reserve Newport County goalkeeper, and it would be the goalie who people were asking for the autographs. And nobody knew who Drakeford was. But he suddenly decided halfway through, oh, I'd better start getting strident too. And he tried it. He wasn't terribly successful. And he stopped people buying Tampaxes in the supermarkets, things like that. Mad, sort of crazy authoritarianism. And it didn't really work. But perhaps that's because the voters sniffed out that he was not being authentic. And I think with Sturgeon, she is an authentic posse boots. And it really is, that is who she is. Whereas old Drakeford is a slightly more mildewed creature. And he doesn't, I mean, the goose step does not come to him naturally.
What about Boris, though? Because Boris is, you've known him for a long time. Boris is not, I'm not sure he's a libertarian, maybe a libertine, but he's certainly had a relaxed view throughout his career about people being allowed to sort of get on with what they want to do. And then he
doesn't like rules much. He doesn't like rules.
And he had this bizarre start to the crisis, where he didn't seem to quite know what to do, and then of course was almost kiboshed by the whole thing, and he now seems to be reinvented as someone who is quite happy for these rules to be in place. Or is he? Or do you sense, when you're sketching him, do you sense that he's uncomfortable?
I think he's quite crafty. I don't know if he is uncomfortable. I think he's always comfortable if his poll ratings are going okay. That to him is the most important thing. But I think he's positioned himself quite craftily, and he's allowed Matt Hancock to become the chief dictator in the government. And so he's been quite, I mean, Sturgeon has been very much the one who's been telling everyone off. And Boris has been holding back a bit because perhaps he senses that he wouldn't be doing it very well, but also that people are going to get very bored of this. And they are bored of it. I think people are really fed up being told what to do. And, maybe he's timed it well, but Boris had a very odd pandemic, hasn't he? Yeah. He almost disappeared, literally, and that must have shaken him a bit and done peculiar things to his head, I think. And as far as the lockdowns, you could always sense a bit that Boris was trying to pull it back. He was the most reluctant person in the government to do the lockdown, or so he was having us believe.
Yeah, there's a hilarious chapter called "Good Evening" about communication in the crisis. I love the section when you explain why prime ministers make televised addresses to the nation. It's generally a sign that A, there has been a cock up, the PM is in the fish soup, and C, other methods of communication having failed, Downing Street has decided to cut out the middleman and take its mouldering wares to the voters directly, because they tend to be more generous minded than Fleet Street or Parliament.
Well, I mean, that's fair, isn't it? I mean, there was during the Brexit crisis, Theresa May was on television more than Holly Willoughby. She kept on popping up and doing this special announcements from Downing Street, and in the end, her ratings fell a bit. But yeah, I think when a prime minister does an address to the nation, with a almost sort of scrambled egg on their shoulders and the national flag behind, you always sense something's gone disastrously wrong.
Do you think? You've been sketching for a long time now. Do you think are politicians getting worse, or has anything changed in terms of the general standard or their approach?
No, I don't think they're getting worse. I think they're pretty much the same. And I think they've probably been the same since the days of Harold Hardrada and Harold Godwinson. I think that the ruling pressures have always been the same. And I suspect that if you look at someone like William Gladstone, you'd probably see similarities with Boris. Perhaps not in their morality, but actually, you never know. That's like going out late tonight. So I think that the what has happened, certainly, standard of parliamentarian has ebbed and flowed a bit. It was terrible in 1997 because there was a landslide election which brought in lots of people who had not expected to become MPs, and some of the Labour intake of 97 were pretty ropey. And a little bit of that has happened this time. There are one or two MPs on Tory benches, backbenchers, who, looking surprised still that they are there and are pretty incapable of speaking in public, or they don't seem to have a fully formed worldview. But are politicians getting worse? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think they're getting funnier because we see more of them, and we see them on trying to groove up on social media. I mean, Hancock is a classic. Hancock is a piece. He's a collector's item, sort of doing his press ups on television and his own TV channel on the internet and all that sort of thing. So I worship Hancock. I mean, sketch writers will be very sad the day that Hancock goes. But we used to have John Prescott, and we used to think we would never do better than John Prescott. But then along came Gavin Williamson. So I'm pretty confident that sketch writers are going to be in business for a while yet.
Yeah, there's almost an entire in fact, it's too rude. I can't read out the caption about Matt Hancock from the book to do with the badge and the
pinprick.
Yeah, exactly. Watch out for the little prick. It says Hancock and his carepin. Someone asks about social media. Samuel McHugh And has it been, has that just made the crisis and the way in which politics and politicians are viewed worse? He says, social media seems to play a devastating role in the crisis, allowing people to use masks, etc., as a way of virtue signaling to each other, illustrated by one journalist he mentions, aggressively berating anyone who disagrees with lockdown, etc.
Well, I don't actually look at social media that much. I occasionally do the Twitter thing because my publisher tells me to. And I go on Facebook for my friends and family, but I don't do all those other things. I don't know. I can never remember what they're called. But yeah, I think Twitter's horrible. But I'm not good enough to read it very well. And people always say, oh, they've been beastly about you on Twitter today. And I say, well, I'm afraid I don't know how to look at it. So such life. But a suspicion, Samuel's right. It's not just about the lockdown, but I think lockdown has been certainly the tensions of lockdown, but the tensions of Brexit, I think, were made very bad by Twitter. Suddenly, the media looked at Twitter and thought, "Oh, that's what the country thinks." Oh, rubbish, absolute rubbish. What the country thinks is quite different from what the Twitter sphere seems to think. So, and I think it exacerbated the agonies of Brexit, certainly.
Well, so Nick, I noticed on that question, asks, wasn't Brexit itself quite bossy?
Well, only if you think that democracy is bossy, and I suppose that would be a political theory, but not one I would necessarily subscribe to. And my theory, you see, about the bossocrats is that they are driven, sometimes propelled, by a desire to do good for them, for their own bank accounts. And I don't think you say that about the British voters with Brexit. A lot of them voted having been told repeatedly it's going to make you poorer, and they still did it. So the money argument doesn't quite work there. But do you think that democracy is wagging its finger at you? Well, that's a view.
No, but I just wonder whether the sort of, I was, as somebody who voted for Brexit, I was very wary of the whole will of the people sort of mantra. I mean, I get the point. To me, there's a distinction between democracy is a complex thing involving all sorts of overlapping institutions, rather than there being a single will of the people. You know,
the will of the people thing was only, people only started banging on about the will of the people because they sensed that there was an attempt to frustrate the will of the people. And if on the 24th of June, the British establishment had turned around and said, "You voted that way, we're going to do it," and had not dug its heels in, and Tim Farron came out that first day and said, "We're going to try and stop it," then I think there wouldn't have been such shrieking about the will of the people.
Were you surprised during the whole Brexit business that there were significant numbers of people trying to stop it? I was possibly naive in the first couple of years of it, that I couldn't quite conceive of the idea that they would go as far as to try and reverse it.
I was surprised that they were so blatant about it. I was surprised that, for instance, the head of the Supreme Court was so political about it. You know, after her judgment, sort of gloating about her judgment. After the one of the judgments, I can't remember. She
there were so many.
But also, I was surprised by how some people in sort of the head of the armed forces reported being at a dinner of plotting Remainers, things like that. Yeah, I was surprised by that. But after an election, you always get the people who've lost saying, "What can we do to rectify matters?" That's legitimate political activity. But it was such a clear-cut, black and white decision, wasn't it, that I was a bit surprised.
And the atmosphere around the Palace of Westminster was absolutely horrible in that period, wasn't it?
Yeah, meaning to one bloke, John Bercow. And he, to me, was a great embodiment of these boss cat times. And my goodness, what an unpleasant little man. And he would sit there in that chair, his legs dangling from the seat. And you got the sense, immediately you walked into the chamber, into the press gallery in the old days, that immediately there was an acidic flavour on the air. And when you walked into the Palace of Westminster, even, I felt, as coming in from Herefordshire, I suddenly felt as if I was walking behind enemy lines. It just did not feel as though that place was representing the British people as they had spoken. And Burke was breaking the rules. He was conniving with certain parts of the House. And I certainly never got the impression that he was an entirely unbiased. The whole point of being a speaker is to be the ref. You're the bloke with the black outfit and with the red and yellow cards. And it is a very bad thing when that ref is not convincingly impartial. The new speaker has completely altered the mood of the House. He's not as clever as Burke. He can't read announcements very well. He doesn't have the gift of the gab like Burke. He's just a nice bloke. He's a decent bloke, and he seems to be neutral. And as a result, the Commons is a far happier place.
When do you expect it to actually be properly back?
21st of June, they're saying.
So you can expect a packed chamber then. Do you think that will happen?
No, I suspect some of them will still be frightened. And I must say I was very surprised. I was doing a radio thing yesterday with Kezia Dugdale, former Labour leader in Scotland. And she said, she said it openly and very movingly, that she was still personally frightened to go out. And I find that difficult to understand, but I know that people do think that. But I'm sorry that people think that. And I suspect that some MPs will be feeling that, and some of them won't be very well, they'll be sheltering or whatever. So it won't be complete back to normal perhaps until October.
It is very odd, the British having chosen to almost not have a functioning parliament during the crisis. Whereas in the US, it wasn't even a controversial decision that Congress and congressional staff would get vaccinated first, because that's how democracy works.
I know that Lindsay Hoyle did think maybe MPs should be vaccinated first, but then he thought about it a bit longer and realised that there would be an almighty stink from fellow journalists, perhaps, and also I think from the public, thinking those bloody MPs think they're a cut above the rest of us. So it didn't happen. We get 50 in the House of Commons at the moment. They sit there with their masks on, inhaling and exhaling like bladders in a hospital. And the mood of the chamber is completely lost. There isn't the give and take. You can't get the interventions in debates that if you've got a virtual speech. And also, you need argy-bargy. You need to have ministers being pushed up against the dispatch box and shouted at, because it makes the ministers better, I think. And we've really missed that. And I think it's miserable. And mind you, Iain, 50 in that House of Commons. The House of Commons chamber is, the size of it. It's about the size of a parish church, perhaps. On Saturday, the chapel in Windsor, which is a far bigger building, they can only have 30 people. And this rule, this official rule, you can only have 30 at a funeral, no matter the size of the church. Even though a church for non-funerals can have 150 people in it, it's just cruel. And the rules have become very, very cruel.
Mm. I do think it's odd, though, the way in which our politics is now. People see politicians and Parliament as other or alien. So they don't. I want Parliament back because Parliament is us. I want the executive held to account. I want ministers to face a chamber full of people roaring and asking really difficult questions, and the place being packed, and the minister feeling on edge. Now, for a year, they haven't had that, have they? I mean, the Lords is now turned into almost a sort of, they get 90 seconds or 2 minutes to say their piece so that they can get paid. Scrutiny.
They don't even have to make a speech. All they have to do is they have to log on to vote, and suddenly, ka-ching, ka-ching, in comes. It's like a wonderful fruit machine, House of Lords. It is ghastly, the Parliament at the moment. Mind you, the select committees have found a modus operandi of some sort. But the chamber itself should be the beating heart of our country, not just our democracy, but it should be where you get the theories of the people, the feelings of the people expressed. And it hasn't been like that for some time, because some of the feelings of the people are not suitable So, for instance, for a long time, the feelings of the people about immigration, I don't feel very strongly about immigration, but some people do. And the feelings of the people on immigration were not being heard. And that led partly to Brexit. And so this is what happens. You've got to have a House of Commons that is a sort of a stinking, noisy pig shed. And that is the way to get people to believe in politics. You don't get people to believe in politics by stopping the politicians from saying certain things.
Let's talk about a couple of other aspects of the book, and quite a few questions on the environment, which I was going to say on balance you're against, but that's not what I mean.
Against the environment.
You're
live in Herefordshire.
I know. It was a joke. But you're certainly against Greta Thunberg, and very funny on Attenborough and all that. I mean, you identify it as one of the bossiest things about contemporary bossy society is what we're supposed to think about the environment.
You know, Greta came to the Commons. Do you remember when she came to the Commons? And
I remember seeing her. Yes.
And Berko was in charge, of course, loving it. And he stood up and he started addressing her as she was up in the gallery, saying how blighted they all were. And then he said the magic words, right? 10-minute rule motion, Mr. Edward Miliband, and Greta fled. So she's quite clever, that girl. she knew that listening to 10 minutes of Ed Miliband was going to be dull. I'm not particularly against Greta. Amazing what she's done. But I get the impression there are people behind Greta who are making who are making a living out of it. And there's that amazing statistic where they did a survey to find out which group of scientists in the whole wide world, which discipline of scientists did the most international travel. And it was the climate change people, who are the same people who are always telling us not to use jets. So that, I'm just a bit skeptical. I mean, what's wrong with skepticism? And skepticism seems to be very out of fashion. If you look at the newspapers sometimes, they don't seem sufficiently skeptical to me about some of this malarkey. The climate change is happening. It's obviously happening. But I just get the impression that sometimes there are people making a living out of it who are enjoying telling us we can't go to Magaluf for a weekend when they themselves get off to Greenland for a summit or something. So, yeah, I mean, I'm just a hoary old skeptic.
Very skeptical about cycling, or rather, sorry, you define it in the saddle. You call them saddle soapsters.
Yeah, well, the lycra jockeys.
Cyclists. It is fascinating the way in which, and you lay it out as to how much money's been spent on this, as you say. You know, parking spaces fenced off, councils spending money on bike champions, free cycle lessons, 2 billion from the Department of Transport, and huge amounts of money to Cycling UK, whose patron is that well-known cyclist, the Queen.
Yeah.
Cycling surely is marvelous, isn't it?
Well, it's marvelous up to a point, but when they start telling you off, and I was wobbling along on a Boris bike one day in London, and suddenly there's a terrible sound of panting behind me. It sounded like some sort of Swedish sex film behind me, and there was a bloke coming past on lycra, bending down over his handlebars, and it was just by the mouth.
Was it Boris?
No, it wasn't Boris. That would have been like a sex film. No, it was, there's that bit where it narrows and you have to get past the bollard.
Yes.
And I was sort of making my very slow progress. And he suddenly started effing and blinding at me because he wanted to go past me. And he called me all sorts of terrible names, which I dare not repeat. And I just thought, he's so bossy. And he told me to get off the road. I should never be on a bicycle again. And I suspect there was a lot of sort of deep down anger issues, as we say in the psychology business, that geezer had. I mean, what was the trouble? What was the matter with him? I was on a bicycle. I was doing my best. I was a bit like Margaret Rutherford on a bone shaker, but I mean, I was doing my best. He was just angry with me for not being one of the lycra gang. And those people who you sometimes see them on the roads around Herefordshire, they're cycling two abreast. If you're on your your Nissan Micra, whatever I've got, you try to get past, they refuse to budge. They make you go 10 miles an hour. They just seem so permanently furious. They should be sketch writers.
Well, we're going to have some audience questions now, and actually, the first question from Chris is on sketch writing.
Right.
He says he's a fan, but asks, "How do you put up with it?" Which is a good question.
Money, Chris.
The money helps.
No, it is quite fun sometimes, because I mean, I got the giggles 2 days ago when suddenly the government sent some completely expendable bloke to answer a question about the lobbying thing, and he so plainly
can't talk about the Prime Minister like that.
he was having a rough old time, and Labour
Paul Scully.
Paul Scully. Labour were getting crosser and crosser and crosser, and the SNP were honking away at him, and this guy was it was like seeing an armadillo going into the defensive position, and just you see the comedy of human, see the vanity. It's that more than anything. The one thing we don't like as sketch writers is when politicians crack jokes, because they are, that's not what they're there for. You try to analyze the character, the way that they walk and talk, and that's what makes it fun.
A few of them are really good at jokes. A small group. So Haig is one of the funniest speakers I've ever seen. I'm not just saying that because he's just joined the Times as a valued colleague of both of us, but could be very funny.
Yeah, Ed Balls, Chris Bryant can be very funny.
Yeah.
What do you want? You want politicians to be ridiculous? Well, they managed to do it somehow.
So Stephen, I mean, this is a rather rude question actually, but Stephen says, and I think he's read, I'm not sure if he's read the book. Do you think satire may be the best way of exposing the bossocracy? Don't we need a Tom Sharpe to get on and write a best-selling novel on such?
Yeah, well, I mean, more Tom Sharpes, always very happy to have them. I did a novel once. It wasn't very good, but it's a hard thing to do. I'm going to try and do another sometime. But as a reporter, you try to point out the stupidness that you see, and you try to take the mickey out of it. And it's not quite satire what we do. It's just sort of reflecting what happens. More news reporting, I guess, with a bit of a flick. But yeah, Tom Sharpe, wonderful.
No, I really admire a good novelist like that, because Sharpe, I think, is I reread Porthouse Blue, I think, last year, and it still stands up.
But the thing about satirists, Iain and Stephen, is that they are angry, and anger is a very important part about it. So, and I don't mean there's a difference between being bossy and being angry. Yes. And anger is a very useful corrective. It's the House of Commons needs a pumice stone, and we need as many people as possible to give it a good old scrub with a pumice stone.
Yeah, I mean, Simon Raven. That is, I think, one of the
even war. Yeah,
but I'm puzzled that hasn't happened in this current phase in the story of the last 10 years, because life since the financial crisis has been like a novel. I mean, it is just sort of, and Greensill and all of that is just so. I mean, if you scripted it, you try to write it as a novel, people would have said it was too implausible.
Yeah, but to get a publisher to publish, I mean, the real satirical targets at the moment are the establishment. Is always the target, really. And you do not get many browning points if you're a publisher. If, say, you published a satire about the race relations business, I mean, it would be a surefire reputation trailer for the publishing world. So that is a bit of a problem. So look at the BBC comedy. BBC comedy is a really good example of how things are in a bit of a sticky when it comes to satire, because they dare not attack some of the modern powerful interests because they are politically correct.
Just on the theatre, Pamela asks, who are the good young playwrights to look out for? Do you see sort of signs of hope in the theatre? Because that's your working week when you're up from Herefordshire is divided into is divided into the House of Commons, and then you go and do something more serious, which is watch the theatre.
Well, both forms of theatre actually. But who's that? I can always hope this named Pamela. But there's that young former political researcher who wrote a thing called The House.
James Graham, yeah.
James Graham, terrific, really good and fantastic acting in that. And there's also Polly Stedham. Also, I'm terrible at names, but there are some good young writers coming up. And the difficulty is with theatre is that it's so difficult to make money out of it. And to get a young playwright performed on the London stage, I mean, who's doing that now? The Royal Court? Are they doing it? The Royal Court has lost its way a bit. James Graham was taken on, I think, by Nick Heitner at the National. That was a real leap, a real throw. It really was worth it. You need people like Heitner running the big arts centres to take that sort of gamble. I'm sorry, I wish I could tell you more names, but there are some up and coming types, and you need things also like the Edinburgh Festival, which didn't happen last year. I hope it's going to happen this year. On the Fringe, you need to have that where the young talent can come up, and there was quite a fun show called Sip, about Henry VIII's wives, and that started, I think, Edinburgh Festival, and then made it onto the West End and was a success.
So just jumping around on themes here a little bit, but Mark asks, Quentin, do you think Boris has lost his anarchic sense of fun or anarchic sense of behaviour and is succumbing to a much more conventional sense of prime ministerialism? In other words, do you think he's becoming a stuffed shirt? Good question.
I think he probably is, possibly is a bit, but that possibly is inevitable given the pressures of being prime minister and the horrors that he probably gets brought to his desk all the time. So at the moment he'll be having, not just COVID, not just the lobbying headache, but he's also got the Russian-Ukraine thing going on at the moment, plus the economy, plus all sorts of other things as well. I mean, you must be so dented in by the ghastliness of problems all the time that you must lose a bit of your zest. But I think he's coping better than May did. He is not as creamily self-assured as David Cameron was. Cameron was brilliant from the house. Seen that perhaps things weren't so great in other respects. Blair was very accomplished immediately for the manner born, but he had prepared for it in opposition. Boris didn't prepare for it in opposition. And has he become a bit of a stuffed shirt? Well, he has a bit. There's something about Boris still that is very difficult for Keir Starmer to cope with. And you see, Starmer did well yesterday. Normally at PMQs, you see Starmer looking at Boris and thinking, how do I cope with this bloke? Trying to put a dog lead around water because he's so elusive and so undisciplined in the way that he answers questions. And the speaker tries occasionally, but Boris is still a very elusive character.
Do you think, though, corruption could do for the Tories, or the perception of corruption, which sometimes happens, doesn't it? It happened in the 1990s. Happened in the early 1960s as well. Just this sense that they've been in power for a long time, and politics sometimes it just switches. It goes from being about the economy or standard of living, and it just for a while becomes about, for want of a better word, morality or standards or something.
Well, it might do, and big government, big majorities always create a sense of slight indolence about and arrogance. But the major sleaze problems, although there was financial scandal there, the thing that really got the public going was the sex, and that's what made it a great story. We haven't had that yet. I mean, we've had a bit of sex stuff with Boris. Well, we had a bit of sex stuff with Boris about Madame Arcuri or whatever she's called. But the thing is, everyone knows that Boris is a bonker, and it's not sufficiently surprising. So with the major years, the Tories at that time had a reputation as terribly boring, drab people who wore Marxist suits. And suddenly we found that they're all at it, like in a French farce. And that was terribly funny, and the public loved it and took attention of it and decided that they were a bunch of sleazebags. I'm not sure that this lobbying scandal at the moment is sufficiently clear-cut Well, no, I think it's clear cut. I'm not sure it's sufficiently gripping for the average reader yet, but perhaps it will be. I don't know. And also, Boris is rather going along with the calls for something to be done, because maybe he's glad to see Cameron in the shtuck. So it doesn't quite feel to me yet as a total game changer, but I think undoubtedly, it's feeding in to some perceptions.
Had various questions about things like BLM and bossiness on the race question, and I was going to ask you the National Trust. There's a chapter on the National Distrust. I was just going to say the National Trust. It's doing well, isn't it?
Yeah. You can't go to a house nowadays. You used to go to the National Trust to have, and a slice of Battenberg, and maybe give the dog a walk and hope it didn't do its business in the wrong place. But now you go and you have to be given a lecture about sexual equality or sort of slavery or something like that. And I have a feeling that people have had enough. And there have been reports of National Trust volunteers saying, "Oh, stop this, I'm not going to help you anymore," because they've been told to go on sort of unconscious bias training. Unconscious bias training.
I prefer the sound of self-conscious bias training.
Well,
is very
journalists
British,
have that. I mean, what a racket that is. And if you look at the amounts of money being paid to some companies that were being paid by Parliament, I think Parliament's decided not to spend it anymore. But just unbelievable racket, and the nonsense that I had to go. I was on our church's council, our parish council. I had to go along to have training about safeguarding of children, and it was horrendous. There was this former policewoman who told us off for 4 hours, and in the front row was one of our friends who was then 100. She fell asleep in the first 5 minutes, and the terrible message that was given to us by this former policewoman, who's been paid quite a lot of money to do this training, was that we must trust nobody. Now, think about that. How can you go through life trusting nobody? Think about it, particularly if you're a church, and if you take the attitude, trust nobody, how can you possibly be a good churchman or a churchwoman? Taking that attitude, it's complete negation of everything that the Anglicans should be trying to do. Anyway, it was horrendous, and it struck me as an example there. The sort of safeguarding courses that are being done, and the self-conscious training or whatever. There are people making a lot of bread out of this, and they're having very little effect, I think, on the behaviour of people that they're lecturing. And all they're doing is corroding the desire of anybody to volunteer and help a church or a charity.
One of the things I really like about this book is that I mentioned when we were chatting earlier, the sort of echo of the Spike Milligan style of picking out silly conversations and dropping in sort of little anecdotes is a fantastic thing on Black History Month with Morgan Freeman and Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes, where Wallace says, "Black History Month, you find," and Freeman says, "Ridiculous." Wallace says, "Why? You're going to relegate my history to a month." Wallace says, "Come on." Freeman says, "What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? Come on, tell me." Wallace says, "I'm Jewish." "Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?" Wallace, "There isn't one." And it's that sort of sense that in the book, it's beautifully done. But it's because, I suppose it's because it's Morgan Freeman can say it, but other people can't.
Yeah, well, good on him for saying it. Great man, and terrific actor too. But it didn't have an effect. That conversation was 15 years ago, and what Morgan Freeman's his position has been completely ignored. I mean, Trevor Phillips has tried to say the same thing, and is written off. Trevor gets terrible abuse from on the twist from a lot of white people, telling him off and telling him what to think about black rights. It seems to me mad. And long live Morgan Freeman, say I. Morgan Freeman for president.
There's a lovely passage, just a final question, though I should mention, so we did have several questions. We had a question from Modwena and a couple of others about churches And Modwena asked, what do you think about the police breaking up a church service in Balham? You did talk about the crematorium earlier, but that's a more recent incident in Balham. It was really quite sinister.
Was that the Polish church?
Yeah.
There was one the other day,
yeah.
but there have been others as well, and horrendous. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. And almost more offensive than anything was the grammar of the policeman who then stood up and said, "Please, may you go home." It was grotesque, wasn't it? And the officialdom, the official class, the bossocracy, seems to have lost the concept of letting things go through to the wicketkeeper. Turning a blind eye. And sometimes it's very useful for officialdom to just say, "Oh, we won't get involved there. We won't go barging in and break up their Good Friday service, the most solemn day in the Christian year." And I was appalled by that. I'm not often appalled, and sometimes made mildly cross, but I really was appalled by that. It struck me as grievous and bruising and bloody, actually. The congregation were tremendously polite and nice about it. But I wasn't there because I think I'd have probably got arrested. Now,
the final question from me, the postscript, done bossing. You finished on a sort of optimistic note about the miracle of civilization, and you think that this bossiness and that this almost sort of religious mania to enforce, or it's equivalent to religion, it's another political system that will pass. You think?
I do. I think it's going to pass quite quickly as well, and all the sort of grievance politics, the board of it, and but I do think that powerful people they peak and fall. Go to the House of Lords, you see yesterday's rabble rousers in a state of molting decay, and that's the human story, isn't it? That's what happens to us. But I do hope that the British will rediscover. I mean, to me, the most important expressions in British life, please and thank you, and more marmalade pudding, please, is stop bloody bossing me about. We've got somehow to rekindle the idea of bloody-minded refusal to accept authority, and we need to tell our children. And this Eton master who tried the other day to do that, to instill in his children skepticism, and he was then sacked. Outrageous. We've got to just encourage our children, just occasionally break the rules. I think it's very important.
On that note, I recommend Stop Bloody Bossing Me About, how we need to stop being told what to do. We'll send the link to Reaction subscribers if you would like to order a signed copy. I want to thank Quentin for taking the time to join us this evening. Absolutely fascinating conversation, really interesting book. If you are not a Reaction subscriber and you've crept onto this call, then feel free to go to the site, become a subscriber. You get my weekly newsletter, you get all of the journalism produced by our brilliant team and our columnists. And until our next event, thank you very much for joining us.